This is Chapter 16, Part 1. Chapter 16 deals with pricing. And what we will talk about in Chapter 16 are pricing in terms of what it means for consumers, and particularly how consumers evaluate prices. And part of that deals with how consumers evaluate prices in such a digital world. The second thing is to consider how a company should set products, particularly for products that are new to market. The third thing that we'll discuss and work on is calculating and understanding the role of elasticity of demand and then break-even points. And that's something you very likely have done before, so we will cover it pretty briefly. And then how and when should a company adapt or change its prices? And one thing to point out that I want you to remember as we go through this chapter is that price is definitely not just a number on a tag. It might be the thing that you deal with the most as a consumer, but for companies and brands, price means a lot of things. Pricing decisions in general are a very complex series of tasks. Managers who determine the price of products have a lot of things to consider before setting a price. And even when they do set a price, oftentimes they may realize that the price point they have determined is not satisfactory. So they must consider things like what competitors are doing in terms of their pricing system, what customers perceive from the price point. They have to also consider what the goals of the company are. And then the broad marketing environment, the external forces that may affect how people perceive price and other things that may be going on that could affect the cost structures, the delivery system, and things like that. Prices have to be consistent, though, with the company's strategy. It has to be consistent with the target market and what the target market sees as acceptable. And it has to be in line with the positioning of the brand based on what competition is doing and criteria that are important to customers. But keep in mind that, and this might be easier to think about in terms of the price tag itself, pricing is some form of communication for the brand because it signals something about the product of the brand to consumers. We use as consumers price as a signal for quality inferences, for example. We typically see that, or we typically perceive that the higher priced something is, the better quality it should be. And that's not always true, but that's a general perception. Certain price point thresholds may move a product from kind of one level of competitor to the next. So it's a signal to consumers, but understanding how they interpret that price is what the firm should understand. Now let's talk a little bit first about why the digital world is important when we think about price. You probably realize that the internet has really changed the way buyers and sellers interact. And this is just a kind of quick list here on this slide of how the internet allows sellers to sort of discriminate between buyers and how buyers can discriminate between sellers. And you yourself probably use the internet and technology and other digital tools in your consumer behaviors. I personally am a pretty consistent price checker. I use my mobile devices to check prices. I use the internet constantly to find the best deal or the best delivery, free shipping, and things like that. And sometimes you can even negotiate a price online. So there is a lot of reasons why the internet has really impacted pricing and how consumers deal with prices, but also how firms should think about the information that's available to consumers before they make pricing decisions. Now let's talk a little bit about one of the kind of common, or two of the common ways that companies set their prices? What we find a lot of times is that small companies, maybe they don't have the human capital, or they just don't have the complexities to use other factors in their pricing decisions. But in these cases, we find that oftentimes it's the boss or the manager or the owner of the company who sets the prices. And they use probably competitor pricings as the most relevant benchmark while considering their costs. But in larger companies, it's often done by the product or brand line managers. But even here, sometimes top management can set pricing objectives and policies that approve lower management's proposals. So it's kind of the funneling down. And sometimes they do it well and sometimes they don't. How companies should price, no matter what size they are, is to have an understanding of things like consumer pricing psychology, right? How do we interpret prices and price endings and price thresholds? And using a systematic approach to not only set the price, adapt the price, and change the price. And another thing besides the digital world is that we're kind of in this really unique, I don't know if unique is the right word, definitely a dynamic environment when it comes to pricing. And this has led to pricing practices changing quite a bit in the last probably decade or so. And part of it is due to an economic slump that had occurred and then sort of a slow recovery that came after that in conjunction with rapid technological advances. It's also somewhat attributed to generational cohorts, and in particular, the millennials and some of their kind of consumption values that have surfaced as very common among this generation. They have different attitudes and values about consumption than the generation that preceded them. So the millennials have sort of given a new rise to, I think some of these are more older practices, but they're more interested in renting, bartering for goods and services rather than paying money, that is, and maybe sharing. And these are seen as really valid and useful options for consumers in this cohort that really kind of disappeared in some of the generations before them. Some people say that these new behaviors are creating this sharing economy that reduces consumption, or not consumption, but reduces ownership, but may actually increase consumption. So for example, consumers are sharing bicycles. So you rent a bike, downtown, and you spend $5 and you have it for the day and you bring it back. The Zipcar is something similar. Trading or sharing clothes or furniture. And there's been a new rise to these kinds of businesses because consumers have a different perspective on how they should consume. So these things affect the pricing environment, because one thing that companies maybe don't have as much expertise in, if they've been around for decades and decades. Think about somebody like Enterprise Rent-A-Car. How do they really compete with Zipcar when Zipcar will allow you to simply, easily walk up and rent a car for a couple hours, bring it back, and Enterprise has a little bit of a different model. How should they compete based on price? Uber and Lyft, kind of in that same transportation space. How can they compete with Uber and Lyft when people used to need to rent a car? Now they're willing to spend a little bit more money, maybe, but have more convenience. So these are problems too that have been a challenge to the modern pricing strategies. Now, previously, consumers were often considered what we call price takers, meaning the company would set a price and customers would just say, okay, I'll buy it. And that's what we mean by price takers. But modern consumers are not price takers. They are willing to be brand switchers in order to get a price that's more satisfactory. And they base purchase decisions on how they perceive prices and what they consider the current actual price to be, not necessarily what the marketer's stated price is. This also deals with lower or with price thresholds. In a price threshold, they may have a certain level of price where they believe a product, if they're priced below it, it's of inferior or unacceptable quality, and something above it is more acceptable. But then there's a price ceiling where if it's above a certain price, they're unwilling to consider it, or it appears to be not, worth the money. And different people interpret prices in different ways. And this is another reason why segmentation and understanding perception of prices is so important, because you may be able to segment your market based on these price perceptions. And some of the ways that people interpret prices differently are through what we call reference prices, price quality inferences, and price endings. And we'll talk about each of these briefly. Okay, so reference prices basically mean that consumers have some kind of fallback on what they think something should cost. And all types of reference prices are possible really in any given scenario. And these are possible consumer reference prices. So sometimes, though, marketers can or sellers can manipulate the reference price. As an example, a seller can situate its product among expensive alternatives or competitors and hope that that will imply that the product belongs to the same price class. Department stores, sometimes they will display women's apparel in separate departments and differentiate them by price. And then the reference price within that department becomes something that the consumer will remember. And they'll make assumptions about clothing within certain departments. Sometimes marketers also encourage reference price thinking when they provide a high manufacturer's suggested price. And I think we've all seen this, that MSRP, and then they cross it off and give their price or their sale price, hoping that you'll think, oh, this product is worth $40 more and I'm getting a good deal on it. That's pretty common. And we see a lot of mimicry too. So, you may have a reference about what one milk will cost because it has the word organic in it, and that's a reference to organic milk. I think this milk is probably going to cost about $5 or $6, which is a lot for milk. This one here, just plain old vitamin D milk, my perception, because I buy a lot of milk for myself and my kids, is that this is going to be around $2. If they merely add the word organic here, I'm probably going to increase my reference price for this one, even if it remains generic. So that's a reference price for organic milk. We also have price quality and price ending references. Price quality inferences mean that consumers use price as an indicator of quality. So we've talked about that already. We find that this image pricing is very effective with products that tend to be ego boosting, image related, things like expensive cars or clothing, things that are part of what we call the extended self. So things that maybe are part of your identity, things that you wear on your body or display at your home. So the more expensive something is, the better it can make you feel, or you think it's of better quality. And a lot of times that probably is true, but when you shop for generics in terms of like grocery items, I think a lot of times it's not true. So I think, different consumers think different things. My perception is that that's probably true when it comes to technology products, electronics, and things like that. And that might not actually be true, but that's my perception. Price endings are also influential in consumer pricing psychology. A lot of sellers believe that prices should end in an odd number because of the way consumers perceive the price or actual cost to them of that product. So if you price something at $299, consumers may perceive it to be in the 200 range rather than 300, even though you and I both know $299 is pretty close to 300. And so we do see that used quite a bit. Okay, that's the end of part 1.